Hello lovely people, I'm Jessica and I use she, her pronouns. Yes, pronouns. That thing we all use every time we talk. On this channel I share content about a variety of topics including chronic illness, disability, queer history, vintage fashion and my experiences as a lesbian parent of 1, soon to be 3. Apparently the jump from 1 to 2 children is a lot, so interesting to see how that's gonna go. Welcome to the second part of how to talk to boomers. Not all boomers, I hear you cry. Well, sure, I know. There are some good ones, but also some not great ones. And if you're feeling like this video is personally attacking your point of view or your beliefs, then maybe it's time to take a look at yourself. The world turns, life moves on. As a society, we're constantly evolving down the generations, and I hope that the world my children spend their adult lives in is more progressive than my own. Isn't that what we should all hope for? You know, the development and progression of the human race? Today we're going to be discussing how to counter common right-leaning talking points you may encounter, generally from older individuals in your life. Some of those Gen Zers. Gosh, social media can sometimes be a cesspit. Admittedly, I had a hard time naming this video. Is it about the economy, mental health, capitalism? It's always about capitalism. Now, since most of my audience are millennials or Gen Z, let's break down some of these, shall we say, mistaken beliefs that the baby boomers in your life may hold about you. Also, hello Gen Xers, apologies for not mentioning you in part 1. We are obviously in this together. Think of these videos as a resource for how younger generations can respond to older generations. Are people still saying, okay boomer? Basically, we're going to discuss some points you can make in response instead of saying, okay boomer. Before we dive in, I want to give a content warning. This video will discuss sensitive topics including racism, ableism. It's a lot going on in the world right now. A lot. Feels like every day we get hit in the face with a new awful news headline. We don't have to talk about this. We don't have to deal with this. Go and watch some fun, just me, just some clothes. If you are not feeling like a discussion of whether or not certain identity characteristics mean that we no longer have the right to exist. Why is this a debate? A caveat about generational differences. There is data to suggest that generational differences are negligible, and their broad generational stereotypes like how millennials are lazy or entitled are almost completely unfounded. After all, every generation reaches an age and then looks at young people and goes, ugh, so lazy. Back in my day. Trust me, they also did it in the 1920s. And in the 1800s, young people, they're just not enjoying the coal mines. It's also important to acknowledge the massive cultural differences within generational cohorts. Neither boomers or Gen Z are a monolith. However, it is also true that when it comes to certain political issues, there do seem to be significant generational divides. A 2023 piece by Bob Duffy, a professor of public policy and director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, and Dr. Paul Stoneman, a research associate at the Policy Institute, has the title, Are Millennials Really Killing the Tory Party? And yes, I certainly hope so. They write that there is an immutable truth that younger groups will, on average, be more comfortable with changing social norms than older generations. And that's certainly the case on the culture war issues we've seen increasing focus on. There are steep age gradients on attitudes to political correctness and free speech, trans rights, and the British Empire. Boomers, Hans. Like, how many of you guys have got divorced? What would your grandparents say to that? As an aside, can we stop referring to people wanting basic human rights as a culture war, please? The data shows that millennials aren't getting more conservative as we get older, which I feel does change the dynamic of the conversations we end up having about these issues. You young people are always whinging about discrimination, but I think it's very unfair that you're just assuming that everyone in my generation is homophobic or racist or whatever people have decided to take offence to today. I understand that it can feel unjust to be automatically labelled with terms like homophobic, racist or prejudiced solely based on the generation you belong to. And it's important to recognise that individuals within any generation hold a diverse range of beliefs and attitudes, and it's unfair to paint everyone with the same brush. While it's true that certain generational cohorts may have grown up in environments with different social norms and values, it's crucial to avoid making sweeping generalisations and instead focus on understanding individuals based on their own merits and actions. Oh, Sorry, you have no idea how many spam calls one person can get in any one day. Actually, to be fair, the thing for me, because I will be honest, I avoid all phone calls. Could be anyone. I mean, I'm deaf, so I've got an excuse. But why do I keep getting texts from unknown numbers? Well, Incogni understands this headache, and luckily they're the sponsors of today's video. Incogni is a personal data removal service. It automatically removes personal information related to you from public websites and private databases, and the steps are very simple. 1. You just sign up. Just create your Incogni profile. 2. You grant them the right to act on your behalf. 3. You sit back and you let them do the work for you. Because you're clearly one of those who don't want to work anymore. That was a wink. Incogni make exercising your right to data privacy easy by automating the data removal process. You can keep your eye on the removal progress through the dashboard and the regular privacy report. Plus, they continually track down and add new data brokers and people search sites to their list, so your level of protection keeps improving over time. If you're ready to get your data back, then click the link in the description or use code JESSICA to get 60% off your annual Incogni plan. Click. Absolutely. Save yourself the headache. Toolkit for talking to boomers.
Young people are so entitled and lazy. No one wants to work anymore.
Is it true that no one wants to work anymore? Or is it that people aren't willing to work exploitative jobs for minimum wage anymore? Wow, we don't want to spend our summer holidays in the coal mines? Or leave school at 12? Shocking. Golly, my goodness. In a piece for Bloomberg in 2022, reporter Joe Constance points out that a $15 hourly wage no longer cuts it for most workers in terms of covering basic expenses, especially as housing costs surge. The living wage for a family of 2 working adults and 2 children is $24.16 per hour, according to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's minimum wage calculator. To make a living wage, a single parent with 2 kids earning the federal minimum wage of $7.25 would need to work 235 hours per week. So 6 full-time minimum wage jobs. Which, let's be clear here, is not physically possible. Joseph McCartin, a Labour historian at Georgetown University, explains that the idea that people don't want to work sidesteps the key issue, which is that a lot of jobs, for the amount of wear and tear and the hard labour involved, just don't pay enough. Very often what this kind of rhetoric, whether it's people don't want to work or there's a labour shortage, what it often speaks to is that wages simply aren't attractive enough for workers. And while it might be convenient to assume that the supposed lack of desire to work originates with whiny millennials or lazy Gen Zers, that's just demonstrably untrue. In fact, political scientist Paul Ferry of the University of Calgary put together a Twitter thread of newspaper clippings that include "No one wants to work anymore," going as far back as 1894. So don't worry, old people have always been complaining. The 1864 clipping is from the Rooks County Record and reads, "With all of the mines of the country shut down by strikers, what will the poor editor do for coal next winter? It is becoming apparent that nobody wants to work in these hard times." Essentially, there's nothing new about people wanting better working conditions and being criticised for that. As Eloise Hendry puts it in a 2023 article for Vice, it doesn't feel like an exaggeration to say young people have been gaslit by older generations when it comes to work. As wages stagnate and costs rise, the generation that got free university education and cheap housing have somehow convinced young people that if we're sad and stressed, then simply a problem with work ethic. We're too sensitive, entitled, or demanding to hold down a real job, when really most of us just want a decent night's sleep and less debt. Don't even get me started on university debt. And we're British. My wife still has like over 30 grand's worth of university loans after having graduated like 15 years ago. Why did our parents make us take these things? Why did school not educate us on financial literacy? To quote Robert Reich, who is the former US Secretary of Labour, so he probably knows what he's talking about. Let's get one thing straight. There is no labour shortage. There is a shortage of employers willing to pay their workers a living wage. Instead of "no one wants to work anymore," try "no one wants to be exploited anymore."
But why are you wasting your money on Netflix? Even if it does bring you joy, you should be saving it for a deposit. When I was your age, I'd already bought a house. My husband had.
It's not fair to compare the current financial situation that older generations are putting those expectations of home ownership to Gen Z to the housing market and economic conditions into which they were buying their first properties. And just as infuriating as the reality that ever buying a house feels impossible to many Gen Zers is the assumption that it is all young people's fault somehow. Is it a choice that young people are not buying houses, getting married and having babies? Or is that just very expensive? In an article for BBC in 2022, journalist Katie Bishop reported that British property guru Kirsty Alsop incited rage after saying it was young people's own fault they couldn't afford to buy a home. Oh, Kirsty, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. I so love to watch your shows. Don't do that. No, don't make me have to stop watching Location. Alsop, who purchased her own first house with family help in the 90s, suggested today's wannabe buyers spent too much money on luxuries, such as Netflix and gym memberships instead of saving for a deposit. We don't all have families, Kirsty, and we don't all have families who are in the House of Lords, so... The prevailing and incorrect narrative is that millennials and Gen Z aren't prepared to make the same sacrifices that previous generations did. An older relative of mine likes to point out that mortgages had a 14% interest rate back when he took his first mortgage out. 14% of what, sir? And exactly how much of your take-home pay did that amount to? Because I'm betting it was not as much of a large chunk as people are dealing with today. The assumptions that young people just need to cut back on that avocado toast might be even more hurtful from people who are literally in charge of financial institutions. As journalist Ryan Coogan pointed out in an independent article in 2024, writing in January that NatWest boss Howard Davies this morning claimed that it's not that difficult to buy a house. As Coogan goes on to outline, it's incredibly damaging when these issues are branded as young people just not wanting to work anymore, rather than actual economic challenges. The typical UK house price as of December 2023, £287,105. And the average UK salary hovers somewhere around the 35,000 mark. That house price is going to rise sharply if you want to live anywhere near a job that will pay you a decent wage or a good school. And that salary is going to dip drastically the closer you get to affordable housing, with neither trade being betwically equal. Coogan clarifies that the method used to calculate the average UK salary is calculated by means. Means calculation. It's a means calculation. Do you remember your maths from school? That means there are massive portions of the country who are earning nowhere near that 35,000 because we have billionaires and millionaires. And that is such a low number if you think about it in terms of wealth disparity. Jesus. Plus, the rising living costs and ridiculously high renting prices mean that saving anything feels like an insurmountable challenge for young people. Okay, yes, I added ridiculously high, but the piece does specifically mention greedy landlords and unfettered price gouging on essential services. I own a house, and I happen to own a house purely because I married somebody who's, this is kind of sad, but I married somebody whose parent had just died and they had therefore been left a property. Like, that's not a situation that's particularly normal for young people. Oh, and then there's the fact that many millennials and Gen Z had to pay for our university education, and many are still chipping away at the interest on their student loans. I think I now am paying more in interest than my actual loan repayment. Plus, while the average 2-year fixed-rate mortgage in 2022 might have been 6.43%, which might sound low, when that was announced, Leeds Building Society looked at historical data to calculate the equivalent mortgage rates. Their findings state that interest rates of 6.43% may seem lower than the mortgage rates of 15% which borrowers were paying in 1980, for example, and our elders like to comment on repeatedly, mention again and again, forever complain to us about and tell us how good we have it. But there is a critical difference. Surging house prices, driven by a lack of supply and historically low interest rates since the financial crisis of 2008, and the commensurate increase in household indebtedness, mean that the 6.43 mortgage rates of today are equivalent to a rate of 25.7% in 1980. There you go. That's your boomer comeback. Why are we still expecting Gen Z to get on the property ladder when building societies are literally saying that housing is now at its least affordable point since records began?
Nobody in our country is having babies anymore. But people in Africa and China are having too many.
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. You see how that's just straight up racism, right?
No, I just don't want British culture to be destroyed by...
Let me just stop you there. The incorrect, unfounded idea that white Europeans and Americans are being systematically replaced by people of colour, commonly known as the Great Replacement theory, has been increasingly mainstream over the last 8 or so years. It gives me such a bad taste in my mouth to have it just... What is wrong? Why would... In fact, journalist Steve Rose explains in a 2022 Guardian article that the innocent-sounding name may itself be a factor in this because it doesn't necessarily sound racist, neither overtly offensive nor racist. It has the ring of a respected academic proposition and just slips easily into mainstream discourse. It's also vague enough to accommodate a spectrum of view from extreme to moderate, yet tucked within is 3 words, our centuries worth of racist and white supremacist ideology. Whether or not the folks sharing them are always aware of this, concerns about birth rates are rooted in racist ideas. And, of course, Rose points out the immense irony in all of this, writing that counter-arguments to the Great Replacement theory would point out that, if anyone has grounds for complaint, it is the indigenous people of North and South America, Australia and New Zealand, Africa and many other parts of the world who have been replaced by colonial settlers, the aforementioned not magical white people. Native Americans comprise less than 3% of the US population. Yet, thanks to the Great Replacement theory, the people that once forcibly colonized much of the rest of the world can cast themselves as oppressed victims. And that's not even talking about the stupid dum-dums. Trump's immigration accidentally sweeping up members of the Navajo Nation as they attempt to deport people. Deport them where? I ask you. Where? Perhaps you should sweep up some white people and deport them back to England, France, Holland, wherever they came from. Oh, all those people who like to celebrate St. Patrick's Day because their great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was Irish, but now they vote for Trump. Well, they're proud of it. There we go. Send them back. Also, let's be real. British culture in this context often refers to, our legacy of colonialism and the British Empire. What's our favourite food? Curry. As a country, we love curries. Not even ones that we actually took from India. Ones we made by taking their food and then putting gravy on it. There are many good things to be proud of about being British, like nationally funded healthcare system. That's pretty amazing. And it's important to emphasise just how vital the contributions of migrants are and have always been to the NHS. I recommend checking out the Migration Museum's exhibition, Heart of the Nation, which you can view online. I will leave the link in the description.
What about falling birth rates?
There are many reasons why people are choosing not to have children in the UK. There are personal and practical factors at play, financial pressures, especially the cost of childcare, 3 children under the age of 5. Climate change or the impact of having children might also have on a person's career. Also, not wanting to be a parent is, a valid choice. Then there's the 2023 World Health Organization report that roughly 1 in 6 people globally are affected by infertility, and the barriers to queer and trans couples from having children if they do want to be parents. I really liked this Smarter in Seconds reel from writer and educator Blair Amani, who is amazing, about why you shouldn't make assumptions or ask invasive questions about why someone doesn't have children. Also, if you're worried about falling birth rates, how about we discuss the fact that black women in the UK are 4 times more likely than white women to die giving birth?
Oh, back in my day, we didn't have all this mental health stuff, and we turned out just fine. We're fine. Young people need to toughen up.
Do you not think there's value in people being more open about their feelings and more sensitive towards other people's feelings? Interestingly, research from the Policy Institute at King's College London and the Organ Institute in Australia found there's widespread agreement across generations in the UK, from Gen Z to baby boomers, that young people's mental health is worse than it was in the past. Despite this, reporter Lottie Elton pointed out in a Big Issue article that a Resolution Foundation report into the mental health epidemic amongst young British workers released the same week generated a flurry of scandalised news report. "Get a grip, Generation Snowflake," one Daily Mail columnist opinioned, urging young people to stop blaming mental illness for joblessness. The research from King's College London found that baby boomers are much more likely than younger generations to put a potential rise in youth mental health problems down to increased use of drugs and alcohol, which the researchers point out is not borne out by the data, and less likely to attribute it to the increased cost of living or worse economic prospects or the world burning around us. Climate change, it'd be like that. Around half of millennials, Gen Z and baby boomers believe mental health problems were just as common amongst young people in the past, but they just weren't identified as mental health problems back then, higher than the 4 in 10 Gen Z who feel this way. Baby boomers and Gen Z are around twice as likely as millennials and Gen Z to say youth mental health problems have increased because young people today are less resilient.
Exactly. Young people are less resilient.
But are they? Are younger generations truly weaker than older ones? Bishop writes that Dr. Carl Nassar, a mental health professional who regularly works with adolescents and families struggling with generational divides, believes that the trope of younger generations being weaker is largely anecdotal and is based on a mismatch between how different generations express their problems, which could really skew the data on how resilient they really are. There's a quote from Dr. Nassar in Bishop's piece that I think really sums this issue up. Prior generations were taught to repress instead of express, but for newer generations, it's the other way around. One of my favourite articles I read as part of research for this video, albeit one that slightly undercuts the premise of this video, is a 2021 Guardian piece where Gen Zers got to pose questions to a virtual panel of boomers. In response to the question, "Do you think young people are overly sensitive and privileged?" Paul Gibson, who was 63 and an accountant, responded that, "I think they're much more aware and have greater empathy and understanding of people's journeys. So I use words like sensitive in a positive way, not in a Piers Morgan snowflake way, because they're not snowflakes. They're resilient and adaptable and more aware of their world's issues." Oh, I like him. He's one of the good ones. I think the fact that Gen Zers might, on the whole, be more sensitive and compassionate is really admirable and not something to mock, especially by people who are directly benefiting from that compassion as they, for example, take time to talk to you about your misinformed opinions.
Wait, what? Are you talking about me? When did it become trendy to be autistic? Feels like everyone's autistic nowadays.
Well, you might be aware of more autistic people nowadays, but that doesn't mean that everyone's suddenly autistic. It's certainly true that autism diagnoses are increasing, and there's a few factors contributing to this. Firstly, the criteria to be diagnosed with autism has changed over the past decade, which isn't a bad thing. Early research into autism focused almost exclusively on young, white, cis boys, resulting in autistic girls and young people of marginalised genders having been systematically underdiagnosed. It makes sense that as our understanding of what autism can look like for people who aren't just white, cis men grows, diagnoses of women and people of marginalised genders will increase and they'll be able to access the support they need. In 2021, a study published in the JAMA Pediatrics, JAMA stands for the Journal of the American Medical Association in this context, found that 1 in 57, so 1.76% of children in the UK are autistic. In a press release about the study from Newcastle University, lead researcher and Dr. Andres Roman Arastazou from the Autism Research Centre and Cambridge Public Health at the University of Cambridge said, "We can now see that autism is much more common than previously thought." The researchers attributed this increase to autism being better understood by both parents and schools. The press release also points out that the data being used is based on school records, which usually underestimate the actual proportion of children who meet the diagnostic criteria. So it's possible that future research will find an even higher prevalence of autism. And whilst this only applies to the US, the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, which was published in 2013, allowed people to be diagnosed with both autism and ADHD for the first time. In an article for Psych Central in 2023, health writer Sian Ferguson notes that, given that the CDC estimates that 14% of children had ADHD in 2016, it's possible that many people weren't diagnosed with autism because they also had ADHD. Oh, what? You can have more than one disability or neurodivergence? How unexpected, and definitely not something that disabled people themselves would have been able to tell you. Golly. In addition to all of this, there's the very real historical context that in previous decades, autistic people, like many disabled people, were hidden away and deliberately kept out of sight. Disabled people were often institutionalised, stripped of their agency and humanity, and, as radio producer Victoria Brignall writes in her 2010 Disability History Month series for New Statesman, this was considered to be for their own good. Brignall writes that institutions regularly regarded their disabled residents as second-class citizens and showed them little respect. Staff often made little attempt to empathise with disabled people's experience, denying them autonomy, choice and dignity. In care homes and special schools for disabled children, there was sometimes hardly any attempt to meet the children's emotional needs or to acknowledge their individual identities. Whilst the 1944 Education Act had recognised in law that disabled children should be educated in mainstream schools, it came with the massive caveat that this was only if his presence is not detrimental to the interests of other pupils. As an aside, remember how we were just talking about he being the default pronoun? This is an example of that. In an article published in the History of Education in 2007, Felicity Armstrong, Emeritus Professor of Education at the University College London, writes that schools have been and continue to be part of the capitalist means of production, which reproduce the social groups and the necessary labour force to support the continuation of the capitalist system. The placement of disabled children in segregated schools prepared them for a life of marginalisation and inactivity. If you're interested in a deeper dive into this particular topic, you should check out my video discussing the ugly laws, which made it illegal for disabled people to exist in public in the US in the 19th century. It can be quite distressing to think about the ways that disabled people were deliberately excluded from society, but it's also relevant to understanding why it might seem like there are more disabled and neurodivergent people nowadays. It's not that there's suddenly a massive increase in autistic people, it's that autistic people are allowed to be visible and we are finally listening to their voices.
But none of the people I see talking about autism on social media look like they're struggling, which must mean they're just saying they're autistic because it's a cool trend. I know about trends.
Autism isn't a trend, but increased visibility and understanding means people can find information, share resources, and build community online and in person. More people self-diagnosing with autism doesn't mean that they are trivializing it, but actually speaks to how inaccessible formal diagnosis is, with massive waiting lists in the UK. And autism isn't trendy. It's a disability, which has a very real impact on people's lives, regardless of whether or not you can see that impact. And I want to finish this section with a quote from Unmasked, The Ultimate Guide to ADHD, Autism and Neurodivergence by Ellie Middleton. Society's answer to an increase in diagnosis shouldn't be, oh my god, everyone has ADHD and autism now. It should be, oh my god, how did we manage to let so many people down? I also think it's interesting that a lot of the criticism of autism and other neurodivergences being trendy has happened in step with these diagnoses becoming more accessible for women, and people of colour in particular. Oh, what's that term again? Oh, misogyny and racism. Yes. I hope this video has been a helpful resource for navigating conversations with the boomers in your life. Would you like me to break down other boomer talking points? Should I make this a longer series? Please leave a comment below and let me know. And if this is your first video, again, hi, there is a part 1 about how to respond to common right-wing leaning talking points about LGBTQ+ issues. You can click the card above or the link in the description. Thank you to Incogni for sponsoring this video. If you are ready to get your data back, just click the link in the description or use code Jessica to get 60% off your annual Incogni plan. Finally, I am so grateful to my entire audience, especially my clubbies, for making this online space a very kind and positive place, particularly at a time when bigotry seems very prevalent. If you'd like to join, you can do so right here on YouTube. Members get perks like behind the scenes videos and birthday shout outs. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.